Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much to everyone joining us here on campus, and thank you to all those who are watching online. Before we start, I need to go through some housekeeping for those in the building. So we're not expecting any fire alarms this evening, so in the event one happens, please evacuate the building via the nearest fire exit and follow instructions from the fire wardens and security staff. They will guide you to a safe assembly point, which is outside of the main building, over there. Marcus, this put me off. If required, the nearest loos are on the ground floor next to the cafe area. So just to let you know, this is actually the first OU Faculty of Business and Law student lecture that we've ever hosted. And we want to share with you some of our best academic minds and create a more traditional student lecture experience for you to enjoy. This lecture is an opportunity for you to meet fellow business and law students and to interact with our speaker, Professor Kodwani, during and after his lecture. This evening is also an opportunity for students to absorb new knowledge, take notes, share ideas and ask questions. There will be a 15-minute Q&A session after the lecture, and we have event staff on hand with roving microphones and someone also checking online for questions to those of you at home. So, please share your thoughts and feedback with us using our hashtag #OUStudentLecture and email us or complete the event questionnaire. That would be great. And so to our speaker this evening, we are absolutely delighted to be able to introduce to you Devendra Kodwani, who is Professor of Financial Management and Corporate Governance. Professor Kodwani is the Executive Dean of the Open University Faculty of Business and Law, as well as the head of the OU Business School. Professor Kodwani joined the OU in 2004, having worked at 3 higher education institutions in his native India. His teaching portfolio includes undergraduate and postgraduate accounting and finance courses. He has published widely, and his research interests include corporate governance, ethics, and utility industries reforms in the UK and India. His lecture this evening will reflect on liquid modernity. How do you manage organisations in a fluid modern world? So please join me in welcoming Professor Kodwani.
Thank you, Astrid. Good evening to all of you. I want to start by saying that there is word "you" in the title of this talk, so that's an admission that we need a sense of collaboration in managing and even exploring the issues. So I hope there will be questions and answers and any comments you may have, which will further this notion of how do you manage organizations in liquid modernity, which we will talk about in a minute. First of all, welcome for joining. Thank you for joining. I know there are many students as well as ex-students of the Open University who are watching online. We live in a world where 365 days long year appears to go quickly, but a 24-hour long day looks long. Considering the number of times, headlines change during the day, it would look like where did you start morning and how you are ending the day. And it looks so different by the end of the day. Political U-turns, abnormal weather patterns, collapse of established big brands, acquisition of startup companies for astronomical sums of money. They don't shock us. The news, even if it does momentarily shock us, it is crowded out by another news. So this growing normalcy about abnormal events is becoming a new norm. No catastrophic risk, be that nuclear radiation to climate change, has galvanized power, political power, and public opinion to result in radical transformation of political landscape that we witnessed, be that during the civil rights movement or the Great Depression of 1929, and even recent post-World War II 1960s radical movements. So in this lecture, I identify two phenomena that will actually increase the fluidity in the socio-political and economic context in which management and leadership has to be practiced. A source of this reflection is work of two sociologists, Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, who articulated his views in a book called Risk Society, and Zygmunt Bauman, who was a Polish-British philosopher, recently passed away in 2017, who coined the term liquid modernity. In particular, I draw from a metaphor of liquid modernity that Bauman proposed. We will next briefly describe what Bauman means by liquidity here, and then look at a major shifts in the demographic patterns in the world that we are headed for. And these patterns have serious implications, which I will illustrate in context of a country. I will then address the issue of interdependence in human societies. That human societies that share this planet with other living organisms. And I'll demonstrate that by considering the flow of consequences of our consumption and production decisions. The challenges these shifts pose require fresh thinking. Looking back in rear image may blind us to the possibilities of future. I end by raising few questions in the hope that answer to those questions will help imagine forms of organization, leadership and management structures which may help us meet challenges of 21st century that management faces. So fluidity is we know it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. We find that in nature, in liquid, all forms of liquid. And Zygmunt Bauman used that as a metaphor to characterize the society, the contemporary world. In his book, Liquid Modernity, he starts by looking at this statement from Paul Valéry, who was a poet, philosopher, French poet, philosopher from late 19th century and lived until middle of 20th century. Now, Paul's characterization of the times that he was observing in Europe at that time is quite telling. I mean, if I did not tell you about the timeline of Paul's life, perhaps you would relate this statement to today, that someone has just articulated today. Because it so well describes the interruptions and incoherence that we see around us, that it looks like someone has written it looking at the world in 2019, but actually this statement comes from before 1950. And I was struck by a couple of things in what Paul Valéry has stated here, and one of those is the end of the first paragraph on the screen, which says, we no longer know how to make boredom bear fruit. And a preceding sentence talks about we can no longer bear anything that lasts. Now that's a very important statement describing the sense of urgency that we live by and sleep through and wake up with. Anything that has got demand on our attention for more than 10 seconds seems quite difficult. So that lasts. So that's where the liquid comes in. The metaphor becomes that any liquid is never stationary. The movement of slight vibration will cause movement. And the second part of this statement is, can the human mind master what the human mind has made? And it, for me, relates to the fantastic things that human mind has created, and latest of those are the artificial intelligence and intelligent machines. Look to be another set of genies that we have unleashed through the tremendous brain power that we have as a race. Now, these are going to add a bit more to the fluidity. Bowman himself describes the contemporary world, and this is how he characterizes that we live in a world of universal flexibility. Now, it is interesting, the word flexibility is seen as ability to respond quickly, adjust yourself, your behavior, your organization structure, your organization strategy, in a way that it adapts to the context as it evolves. So on one side, there is a positive connotation to the word flexibility in the management context, but there is also a risk implied, because that means that the risk is unfolding all the time. Urgency to change is directly related to the perceived level of risks of various kinds. And while Bowman is generalizing as a social phenomenon, applies to political and other contexts, but I'm trying to use this metaphor that how does that relate to management, practice of management. And as I said, I identified two phenomena, and one of these is not new actually. We have been talking about this since at least middle of 18th century, and that phenomenon is a growing number of people on the planet. Second, unsurprisingly, is the nature, more specifically climate on this planet, that supports and sustains not only us, the human race, but also all other living creatures. So using that as a metaphor, I explore these two, what I consider important but not exclusive forces, social forces and natural forces that we are seeing in terms of the changes to the demographic profile in world and the climate. So since I'm using metaphors here, I think I thought it was easy to explain when I look at the patterns of change in the population, as you would see in a minute, that it's a journey in the social structure, demographic structure, from being a pyramid structure of population to what looks like emerging as the dome structure, and both then have a different set of opportunities and challenges for us in society. But staying on the issue of the number of people, the debate goes back to David Hume and Adam Smith, but it got highlighted more by Thomas Robert Malthus in his essay on population. Thomas Robert Malthus was late 18th century and middle of the 19th century. He wrote 1798 his essay was published, and basically he argued that the sustainable population depends on how much production of food we can have, and growth in the production of food follows what he called arithmetic pattern, which is 1 plus 2, 1 plus 1, and so on. So it grows in arithmetic proportion, while the population was growing in geometric proportion. That means it was going from 2 to 4 to 16 and so on. It's a geometric progression rather than arithmetic progression, which was not surprising given that he was a wrangler at Cambridge, a very clever person, and degree in mathematics. So he was using mathematical framing of the problem. But David Hume, who was, and there are two Scots here, David Hume and Adam Smith, they didn't miss between them a lot of stuff, and they were keen observers of the world. So they again articulated, David Hume particularly articulated this as a food problem and supply problem, and therefore societies cannot grow in population if food production doesn't keep up with the growth of people. And Adam Smith also said the same thing in 1760s, 76 in his book on Wealth of Nations. But he was even more nuanced. He actually identified the cultural problem, saying that poor people, so he was looking at the women in Highlands in Scotland producing 20 children who were actually poor, so it was not making logical sense to him, while the women in the urban areas were not producing that many children, and he makes some cultural commentary on that, but also related that to the fact that poor people lived in unhygienic conditions, therefore the mortality rate was very high, and therefore they were trying to secure at least 2 or 3 who would survive the poverty and live on. That's why they will produce more. So it was a quite very intelligent remark at that time. But Thomas Robert Malthus proposed this as a much more strong argument that actually it will create a big problem. Now, we'll leave that debate there and look at what's happening today. So this is what you see on screen is the fertility estimates of human beings. And what you see here is the current status. So it's coming close to 2 children being born in 2019 on average, and it continues to go down. Okay, now population experts tell us that if the fertility rate goes below 2.1 of 2, it creates a big gap over time. And if you project this to the end of 21st century, you can see we are going down there. So this is one pattern that we need to note. Second pattern is mortality. So you can see in last about 70, 80 years, the mortality rate has gone down significantly. Fewer people are dying. But interestingly, I leave this for your imagination, why you think mortality rate will go up in future. Perhaps you'll get a hint of this when we go through the slides and maybe get the chance to reflect on why I think it's going up later. But looking at the fertility, mortality, what it gives us a net result is growth in population. And you can see currently we are about 7 billion people on this planet. Projection is that we will touch 11 billion and stabilize there by end of this century. And these are the various range. This is the whole range of growth, whichever assumptions. This is based on multiple models that UN has applied. And depending on which assumptions prevail, you'll end up with this profile towards the end of century. So that's the global situation. But if you look at what it has done, falling mortality rate and improving health and economic condition, is that we are living longer. Okay, and when we are living so long that people in the 80 plus bracket are going to go up significantly, and again there is a range here, but it's going to be a large number of people who are going to live very, very long period of time. So if I look at today's structure of population globally, what we have got here is large number of people here under 20, then it goes up slowly going down in the different age brackets. But it's kind of a standard that you have few people in the old age bracket, in the middle age, and then you have a very young population. That's the global pattern. So that's the pyramid I'm talking about. But this is in 1950. This is how it looks in 2019. The shape has changed. That means we have now a lot more distributed population in terms of the age profile. Okay, and you project it to 2100, it looks like this. Okay? So this morphing of pyramids into domes of demography is not an insignificant challenge because it poses very complex issues for us to deal with, both politically, economically, and socially. So what does this mean for socio-economic and political and climate implications? Okay, as I said, I'll reflect on some of these in context of a single country, but before that, let's note that this is a global pattern. It will be very different regionally. So let me give you some insight into how this will be different in different regions. So this is the demographic profile for India, okay, and projections. But all of them, again, you would see end up with some kind of dome. Okay, so it becomes wider, so you have more people in the middle age group, but then it's squeezing, and towards the end of the century you have more people in the higher age groups than the lower age groups in India. This is sub-Saharan Africa. Now this is very significant movement in the context of sub-Saharan Africa because you have very low age here, people, mortality is high, and so on. So this is 1950, steep, and this is 2019, and this is projection for 2100. That's sub-Saharan Africa. China, very similar to India, but this is very interesting. Something is happening here in the socio-cultural sphere, maybe explained by the one-child policy or the cultural phenomenon that you had this abnormal kind of behavior. It is not symmetrical, moving from here in a symmetrical way up, but there's something going on here. Okay, but towards the end of the century, it becomes harmonized more towards narrow dome column. Europe and North America. You can see it is moving slowly from what was already emerging dome structure into a full-formed dome structure by end of century. And this presents its own issues. So let me take an example of Japan here to illustrate why these implications of such changes in the patterns are significant. So this is just showing the fertility rate and mortality rate in Japan and comparing that with world. So this is looking at the fertility in world as we talked about, and this is in Japan. You can see it is more severe in Japan. It is going into negatives. It's not just sustainable two children per woman, it is going into actually negative. Okay, so that's obvious worry for any nation. If they want to remain populated, they need people. What has it done to the population itself? Now this is the population of Japan, about 127 million currently. It is projected to go down to 75 million by end of century. Now that's a 40% loss of number of people in a country in 70 years. Now you can imagine what happens to the demand and supply of goods and services, the productivity. I'm not even going into the social consequences in this slide, but we'll see it in next slide what happens. Okay, so that's Japan. So this is Japan's emerging trend. What is very significant to note is this narrow column. Okay, now these are on the y-axis you have age, people under 20, people under 40, people under 60, and so on. Okay, so you are looking at each row or a bar is a number of people in that particular age group. What does this show? It shows that if this was in conventional sense, if the lower half of the pyramid in 1950 was the working population, the productive part of the society, it is shrinking here. What this will do is using another metaphor, if I saw this society as a three-generation society, so your grandparent, parents, and children, that's a three-generation society. This has now become five-generation society. If I roughly take 20 years as one generation, you have people, large number of people above 80, between 60 and 80, between 60 and 40, below 40, and so on. Now that's a very different social structure. And I would actually call this is not five generation, I would call it five generation plus, because by that time you will have many, many intelligent machines which will be integrated into our daily living. So most of the care, for example, in this society will be provided by machines, because these people will have no time to look after or even hire people, because there won't be enough people to hire for various activities. So the care that will be required here, social or medical care, the occupations that will be required to keep a large number of people here occupied in meaningful economic way, because the challenges that we will be having are, and they are appearing now, politicians are recognizing in Japan, and some of those are like this. One is the pensions, for example. Japanese society, unlike, let's say, Norway or Sweden, they don't have deep pockets, they don't have deep reserves that they can invest in the long-term pension funds. Okay, actually they have, for a long time they have had negative real growth rate in interest rate terms. Therefore, there are not even opportunities to invest, so they had to invest outside. But first of all, you need that amount of savings, and Japanese savings rate is much, much lower than, let's say, Norway and Scandinavian countries. How do you prioritize if you were a political party in 21st century, end of 21st century? What will you be prioritizing in terms of public services, and how do you distribute some of those things? So that's one set of challenges. Then you have a challenge of employment. Even today, Japanese find it very difficult to take leave. Government has been trying very hard to let people go on leave. There are statutory requirements. Japan has been inventing public holidays all the time just to keep people away from work, because they just don't want to take average what do you call the extra work, the extra work that people do beyond their normal allocation is 100 hours per month, which is far too much for some of the people. They're trying people to move, because you got people who don't want to retire, they want to continue working, but if they don't retire, there is already little labor required because of the automation and millions of robots coming into factories. You have problem of keeping people occupied. And it is having cultural, social consequences, because now young people don't want to marry. If they want to marry, they don't want to have children, and that perpetuates the issue. So what does it do for the businesses which depend on employing people is a challenge. Now this is an illustration. If you apply the same framework of analysis for any region or a country, it will surface different type of challenges. But we will just reflect on this one example and move to the second phenomena that I want to talk about. So now this is second, I said I want to reflect on the interdependence of human societies and what it does to us and what we had to do in the organizations. So consider this, that you are sitting in a student house in Sydney and feel hungry, take out your mobile, order something, chicken curry rice, okay? And what that does, it triggers a transaction. And now look at the transaction, how this travels to understand the interdependence. So probably the app that you used on mobile phone sent information over to some servers in Silicon Valley with some startup company having its own servers or using cloud servers of big giants like Amazon, but information got processed there and your transaction information comes back to from street A in Sydney, maybe 2 streets behind your house, into a takeaway shop, and so it has done that mileage, information has been processed, it comes back to the shopkeeper takeaway joint, and what do? They cook the meal and put this on the delivery van. And delivery van could be, in our context, in Milton Keynes, now we have robots delivering things. So if I ordered pizza from my home, very likely a box on the wheels will arrive outside my house and then deliver me. But what has that done? It has again processed the information, which uses GPS navigation, whether it's a driver or the robot, brings the delivery to us. But during that cooking, they took the rice from the store, they took the chicken from the store, and that rice might have come from India. So again, there is a transaction about chicken. It may have come from Queensland or some other part of Australia, but rice may have come from South India. So that's your transaction. Now what does it show? It shows the interdependence not only of the information flow and how information is processed, but also the whole logistic. There's a lot of supply chain issue here, which has taken care of you ordering for a few dollars chicken curry rice and it arriving on you, and you don't worry because you just took a consumption decision. You felt hungry, ordered it, it's there. What are the consequences? What are the implications of such transactions, and what do they mean for us? So let's consider some of those things. Now, first of all, to recognize how this transaction was carried out, it used the real economy as well as platform economy. The real economy being buying of rice, getting them shipped to the shop, buying of chicken, getting them shipped to the shop, and then cooking. That's the real economy. Okay? And then, of course, it culminates into chicken and rice being consumed by you. But there was also platform economy, which is the processing of order and processing of the financial transactions which took place there. Now these entities which have emerged, the most visible forms of these are companies like Amazon, Uber, and other things, who are essentially connecting consumers with the users, suppliers, through various mechanisms of digital technologies. So their main value addition is would be information processing and connecting them rightly in a secure manner. What does this do to our environment? Now, consider the environmental effect of consuming chicken curry rice. Actually, rice is one of the most eco-unfriendly crops. It uses 1 kilo of rice uses about 2,400 liters of water in terms of growing crop. And of course, chicken has its own carbon footprint. So we are not necessarily conscious through our education system. We are not being made aware. We are increasing it now in terms of awareness, but as consumers, we have not yet been so fully cognizant of the consequences of our consumption patterns. And this just shows the interdependence. And technology has enabled that more now. Okay? So that's one consequence. Now, there is an interesting thing going on here. You would have heard of Joseph Schumpeter, an Austrian economist, who argued that the capitalism works on the creative destruction, which means entrepreneur identifies an opportunity and comes to fill that gap in the market, and then you lose the existing patterns are replaced by others. So what you call substitution economy. So actually looking at increasing concern of the citizens and consumers companies are inventing different patterns, different products, services to meet not only the customer need, but also satisfy the concerned citizens and environmental activists and policymakers. So you have companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat in America, which are trying to supply substitutes for meat-free protein substitute products. Okay, so that's an emerging business opportunity. But what does it mean for many other businesses where platform economy and increasing concern for climate, where value chain will become unattractive from the customer's point of view and therefore not attractive, or where platform economy and the third genie we have here in form of information processing capability of the computers, Moore's law, continues to multiply the power of computers doing to information processing as a value-adding activities. Think of Thomas Cook, the major collapse we saw only weeks ago. A fantastic brand for travel industry just went down. Now, if you consider what was the main driver for some of these issues, HMV, entertainment industry, and many other, where the core proposition of businesses is processing information on behalf of consumer to connect the ultimate supplier of a service, let's say hotel or a tourism organizer, and the customer. Now, all that's going to be taken over by the increasing power of machines. So the two questions for me from the business perspective are understanding which of the industries are vulnerable to the information processing capability of machines and intelligent machines, and which of the industries are vulnerable to increasing awareness about climate worry and therefore society rejecting those products. I think those are two. If you were to do a SWOT analysis kind of a thing, you would use two as a framework to understand what are the threats for some of those businesses. But another thing here worth picking up is we are no more just data users. We have become the biggest data producers as human beings. Okay? We are being monitored knowingly or unknowingly on every part of our consumption and production spectrum. So much so that even sleep is not left. If you are wearing a technology, an Apple Watch or whatever, it monitors your heartbeat to everything else while you are sleeping. And all these are being used to nudge us, to recommend products to us and inform us. So this is a bigger challenge, which I don't want to go into, but it is an increasing challenge for policymakers. But let's not forget, we are the biggest data producers. When you are driving car, you are producing data for Google. Okay? When you are wearing any technology, you are producing data. So these have the implications for business. Now, what are the solutions, challenges? If we look back, it's not going to help much, because you think of our framework of thinking assumes national boundaries as real. We still identify with one or other tribe, so tribes are another frame of thinking that we use. We also look at short and medium term, and generally because of the urgency of the stock market returns and expectations and so on, look at the short term, and nation defines the locus of our analysis, becomes a unit of analysis, become boundaries. And all of these basically give you a sense of solidity, stability, and predictability as measures, and methods and behaviors. But all of these actually are no more relevant. There is no stability, there is no solidity, there is no predictability. And that poses a big challenge. And that's where the fluidity, that's where the liquidity becomes a challenge. So how do you do that? I mean, look at past. We have had various forms of organizations, from co-ops to private ownership to a third sector and hybrids of various kinds. We have had organization structures, from hierarchies to bureaucracies to matrix organizations. And we have had some relationship with people as well as capital And in the neoclassical model, we have used land as one of the third item, which is actually quite narrow concept of natural resource. So in future, I think we need to be paying attention to natural resource as a third factor of production. This is the economic framework. And then we have used various types of leaderships to combine the organization and the form of organization to meet the demands of society. Is that going to help in future? So retropia is a play on the word utopia in the sociology, again a concept from Beaumont saying that looking back, is that a solution? I think solution is not looking back, it requires fresh thinking. And here are some prompts for us to think and consider. Happy to take up questions on those, but responsible management that considers climate, that considers not just human rights but human dignity. The point I was making about this part where you may lose even agency as a consumer because we are being programmed all the time so softly and subtly that we don't realize that we are losing our agency. So future management needs to recognize not human rights only, but also dignity and diversity of people. And therefore, the boundaries that we had drawn around culture and other tribes and nations would need to be given a backseat in our reference. Leadership, a bit of humility will do. To assume that we have received wisdom and we'll find a solution is not going to be a great model of leadership. Humility and openness are too important to be ignored because most people will have most of the information that a leader will have. Actually, leader will have always less information than the people they work with. And therefore, they need to be much more humble in approaching this. We need to create forms of organizations where you don't make assumptions of stability and solidity and therefore create space for exploration, a bit of fluidity, because you had to some of the organizations are playing with this. Rather than wait for some disruptor to come from outside, they are engineering the disruption inside. They are setting up sub-units as disruptor units to go and challenge their own internal structures and internal thinking. Toyota is an example for that. They set up a small company, Toyota Connect. Now, this is not R&D type of setup I am talking about. I am saying actually setting up a unit that basically says, okay, I'm going to challenge everything in the organization that we do, and is there a different way of doing things? So we don't, although you don't need too many disruptive people, but you need a disruptive process of thinking, because disruptive people is not necessarily a productive thing, it's disruptive process. And therefore, we need even more empowered groups that explore and experiment and are prepared to fail, and we tolerate that failure to reach to meet the uncertainty. I think to meet the uncertainty, you need certainty of one, and that certainty is certainty of purpose, and that's given. But everything else you had to consider as a fluid thing. We need to have leadership that acknowledges the indeterminism. Now, this is a very interesting concept. Indeterminism was a concept that came out of philosophy from Karl Popper, who gave us the theory of falsification, that everything is true as long as it is not falsified. So he was in a big debate with cognitive scientists and other philosophers, and found that indeterminism was the reality, and therefore to assume everything is known or is knowable is not an easy assumption to make. So I want to stop here and take any questions that you may have before we conclude this session. There are some interesting references, if those of you are excited by this notion of liquid modernity, that you can look up. There are some nice conversations recorded with Zygmunt Bauman, which also you can find on the YouTube and other online platforms. Thank you.
Hi, I do have a question. So, from my memory, when I read a little about management theory, I remember reading about an autocratic approach when things were chaotic and there was an emergency and you needed somebody to take charge and give direction rather than be consultative in your sort of management style. So when the chips are down or when certain things are hitting the wall, you had to be really strong and directive. So if we're living in a world that's in constant flux, do you think that there might be a rise of the more autocratic manager or business leader?
So that's very interesting because it goes back to the point I was making. Do you need to look back as a model? And now you rightly say that autocratic approach, you find that a strong command and control structure which actually flew from army and defense forces to organizations. And as you can visualize on a battlefield, you don't want a lot of consultation if you are under fire from enemy. So you had to have a structure and clear command that somebody follows that. But other than those kind of situations, it is very difficult to anticipate autocratic approach as being effective. The flux doesn't mean that it is burning platform situation. Okay, flux is there. If you see, maybe this is another way, metaphor. Ocean is never flux. Its waves are rising and falling, but still ships navigate through that. And how do they do that? How do they navigate through a rising and falling sea? They just adjust that because of the way they're designed. They can just tide the waves over. So I think its approach is required that allows organizations to be able to keep focus on the core business, but also understand which are the emerging waves and get ready for those waves. And that requires a lot more flexibility and distribution and opportunities that people go and explore continuously so that you are not caught up. So for example, if I look at Google, for example, now if you look at their major success has been, apart from the search engine, most of the other things they have had to buy from the startups, including YouTube, for example. Microsoft has adopted the same approach. Most of the additions to Microsoft Office, like Skype or email itself, was bought from outside. So it is, how do you as an organization create a system whereby people can come through the product line with new product ideas, new service ideas inside the organization, and it's kind of internalizing the entrepreneurial spirit inside the organization, which by nature is experimental and operating on edge.
Professor, just looking at the slide you've got up there, the management of the organisation, just looking at it, I'm wondering, looking at the left-hand side, traditionally organisations, commercial organisations are driven by the capital element of that and getting a return for shareholders and investment. I'm just wondering the rather pessimistic future you were painting due to population growth and also climate change. If there is a conflict there, because population growth you could relate to natural resources and, to people, and climate change to natural resources. I wonder if there's a conflict there and perhaps it's time to start looking at should we be driven by profit and return to investors?
Yeah, I think capital is just one part of the equation in the whole economic cycle, and we have seen different models tried where capital has been made secondary. For example, socialist model was such that they said no more capitalism, we will collectivize the things and then distribute the rewards equally. There has been also not very well known, but actually Mahatma Gandhi, people don't relate economic discussion to Mahatma Gandhi, but actually he had views on economy, and his way of looking at role of firm or enterprise in the society was that the people who manage and own should have a trusteeship view of the business. which is in a way moderate way. You have John and John Lewis in UK is a partnership. But again, they have a clear financial profit as a goal, but it's distributed among the partners. But there's a closer alignment between the owners and the people who work in the organization because they are all partners. But Gandhi was saying of trusteeship. Now that comes closer to looking at natural and human resources in the organization in a more holistic manner. Where it failed to take on was that the dominance of the capitalist system that emerged from the Industrial Revolution and then spread in the whole of Anglo-Saxon world came to acquire such prominence in the literature that most of it got written from that angle, and then it perpetuated through the, including business schools, that this is a model that delivers more efficiency and optimum results for the society. I think there is a debate to be had, what should be the role of capital, because it is only one of those three, that's the one which is actually most liquid. Because you have these threats. Even yesterday debate was there in British radio that, if Brexit happens, some billionaires might not find this interesting, others might find it interesting, and because they are mobile, and this is again the liquidity concept of modern liquidity, that people can just walk with their capital. We associate capital flight with that notion. And so it presents a challenge for us. And I don't think there's an easy answer, because even the most moderate parties also don't want to scare business people, because capital has not just legs, but wheels that fly. Yeah, it's a challenge. Kristen.
Thank you for that very interesting lecture. Following on from the question that was just asked, I was thinking about the importance of certainty and uncertainty and in markets. And I was wondering if we do have a more fluid approach, a liquid modernity approach to how we organize organizations. How might you see that affecting the way that we organize markets?
So, actually there have been many experiments in last 40 years in the what was seen as static, boring industries like utilities. Okay, so the organization of market depends on what the institutional, technological innovations people are prepared to do. Technology, actually, innovations happen even if people don't want, but institutional are there. So let me make it more concrete what I am saying. Once upon a time, it was thought that electricity distribution has to be one behemoth, big organization, from mining of coal through to getting it to our houses. As whole supply chain was one integrated supply chain. Okay, technology enabled that no generation need not be next to the coal mine, because you transport the coal. Then it's happened, but you don't need to have coal plant next to the city, because you could transport electricity through cables. And then you say, oh, I can transport not bulk power, but also local power. So you have evolution. And then suddenly someone said, I could unbundle the whole supply chain and separate the primary fuel company from the generation business, from the transmission business, to the distribution. Okay, so it created very different 5 markets: primary fuels market, generation market, transmission business, distribution business, and now we are in a strange world where even though we have one company producing electricity, but you can buy it from 5 different suppliers at the consumer end. So market structure can evolve depending on the technological development and also the institutional commitment. That may be ideologically driven. So in Western Europe during Thatcher and Reagan era, it was ideologically driven, that markets, as much as you can break them down and make them competitive, it will be good for society. So they push for unbundling of the whole sectors And we have seen that in water, electricity, telecom, and so on. Labour is talking of different thing in the current British context, saying that we will actually nationalize the broadband service infrastructure. Fluidity in that sense is, on one side you had supply side fluidity, but then consumers mobilize the movement and they want to have bit stability in the prices. I mean, try reading the electricity bill in UK. Okay, it's very difficult to make sense of, but it is under threat. Those kind of things are so. One market structure example which will emerge. For example, we are used to going to chemist and buy. Now, what chemist is doing is adding value by translating the technical information about the drugs and giving a safe drug. That this is the right thing as per the prescription. But imagine if that knowledge is transferred to you as a consumer. Retail chemist has no business, because then delivery side is actually more convenient through remote buying. So information processing and technologies are big determinants of market structure, and we can't isolate that question from institutional political commitment to various type of markets and and enabling technology. So which equation, which part technology will do its own work, but which group in the society, technology, capital versus the consumers, has more say with the political power will determine the market structure. Okay, so I hope you got some insights from it. Thank you for joining today. If you would like to give us your feedback, please use this email and give us feedback. And any comments you want to make using the hashtag on OU Student Lecture, you can do so. Thank you for joining us today.